Dr. Bryant. Dr. Bryant was my first professor and served on my dissertation committee, so thank you for inviting me, extending this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And to anybody that's on the board, just thank you. This is my first conference as a postdoc.
Yes, postdoc.
So it has been the best experience because everybody is so welcoming, and I appreciate that so much because I didn't really know what to expect because you're all used to doing this, and this is really easy for you to come in and out and do a presentation. So, and I do teach, so I do this every day, but I don't do this. So I'm very happy to be here. I did recently complete my PhD at Auburn, and this is my dissertation, and I'm going to go through some of this study, but I'm going to focus on a very specific part of it as it related to the theme of the conference. I'm currently in my last class, I guess, ever, getting my administrative certification so that I can kind of look at next steps in what I want to do because I'm in year 30 of teaching, and I still love being in the classroom, but I feel like I'm going to need to move into something else. Okay. On March 1st, 2007, an EF4 tornado ripped through Enterprise, Alabama, and it changed the physical and psychological landscape of our town. And on that day, 9 lives were lost, including 8 students at Enterprise High School. And my study focuses on our principal, Rick Rayner, and how he led in a trauma-informed way through this disaster. And I chose part of my research to focus on because those findings allowed me to find a shared voice in the findings, to be able to present those in a way that although you have to go through this experience to truly understand it, I felt like it was a better way as somebody reading my research to really feel like there was meaning in that experience. So I'm going to focus on that. I mentioned I've taught for 30 years, 15 years were in the English classroom, 15 in the theater classroom, and for those entire 30 years, I've encouraged my students to find and use their voice. So it was really a nice natural step into my research to be able to focus on that and to find a way, even as a researcher, to be able to share my voice. Because again, I tell my students, I want to be a model for what I'm asking you to do, and so I felt like that was a great way for me to also model for them. So after all the interviews and drowning in Post-it notes, if you've been there, you understand that. Did the coding, did the finding the emerging themes, but I wanted to focus on a final way to show my findings. So I did the traditional, typical way of showing my findings, but then there is a way that I'm going to talk more about in this presentation called the Gateway Approach that allowed me to tap into also my artistic side, which is a way to, through poetic representation, to share those interviews. And so I am going to share part of my paper at the end of the presentation because, like theater, I feel like some things are meant to be heard and seen and not necessarily read. And I wanted, again, in keeping with the theme of this conference, to share our unified voice because most of you will not read my 212-page dissertation, but I wanted to share at least that part of it and share it in my voice because I am part of the research. And I'll talk more about the people that were involved in just a minute. So I'm just going to do a really quick overview because, slides. But the problem is that I looked at was there's a lack of training for school leaders to be more trauma informed. We definitely find that there's more of a need for that. But even 18 years ago when this experience happened, that was something that school leaders weren't necessarily getting trained in. The whole idea of being trauma informed is kind of a newer thing that people are looking at in their programs. There's a gap in the literature regarding specifically school leaders during natural disasters, and so I wanted to be able to add to that. And then there is no historical account of the tragedy that occurred at Enterprise High School on March 1st, 2007, and I knew that as someone who was there, it was important for all of us that somebody who understood it was the person who would write about it. And so that became really important to me. My first day of class, my very first class was with Dr. Bryant, and one of the first questions he asked us was, what is a leader? And my immediate thought was Rick Rayner. And this is the principle that I ended up years later doing my dissertation on. And so the impact that he had as a leader then, I knew would be important for others to read about and know about, so that it might help them, not if, but when some sort of tragedy occurs in their school. So the purpose was to look at the facets of his leadership as they related to this event on March 1st, to provide a historical account, and to explore some conceptual frameworks of trauma-informed leadership that I found in crisis leadership. Again, they weren't applied just to school leaders, and so I kind of integrated those two to create a new model. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this part, but here's the conceptual frameworks that I used, and then I took the two and combined them to show that there was a lot of common traits, obviously, that trauma-informed leaders have, that anybody who's dealing with a crisis has, and that in my research questions, I wanted to see, did our leader have these things, even though he was never trained as a trauma-informed leader. So my research questions, what facets of trauma-informed leadership were shown, what facilitated the school leader's ability to lead the school in trauma-informed ways, and what barriers did he face. The significance, I've already kind of mentioned, is there's a gap, and I wanted to be able specifically to help, because I think looking back may help others move forward in trauma-informed leadership. So again, for a leader who hasn't experienced it, he or she is going to, and for leaders who maybe are in the midst of some sort of crisis, being able to look at a case study is often helpful. So I, again, wanted it to serve as a case study, and I wanted it to bring into discussion what changes could and should be made regarding the trauma-informed preparation of school leaders. I spent a lot of time in my research looking at the history of safety protocols. There were a lot of changes that were made because of what happened at Enterprise High School, at least in Alabama schools, as far as building codes and just safety protocols. So it shouldn't take something like that happening for change to occur, but we all know that that is what happens. So I wanted to be able to start those discussions. I'm going to skip through all this. Okay, the lit review, there's a lot of literature about just historical background. I went through the conceptual frameworks. You've all done dissertations, so you know this is not the fun part. So I did a history, I mentioned, of school safety protocols, which also helped me see, this was big, documented requirements versus reality. So again, it made me a little harsher when I'm looking at my own school system and what we, especially after having experienced this, still aren't doing that we could do better. There's a section on crisis plans. There were two specific case studies that I did look at that were specifically related to natural disasters in schools. But again, it was really hard to find those because there's just not a lot of literature. The research design, it is a qualitative research method. I did a historical case study because I wanted to tell the story. And I felt like that was the best way to do that. The population, the who, I did have to bind the study. There were thousands of people that were impacted by this event. But what I chose to do is, the principal is the main focus, Rick Rayner, but then any assistant principals that were willing, and not all of them were able to, some have yet to even talk about this event, but the ones that were willing to, that were on campus that day, and the superintendent, because his office was on campus, so he was able to immediately engage in everything that was happening. So even though he's retired, I interviewed him also. And then there were teachers that were on campus that day. They're still employed at Enterprise High School. I am one of those, and then I have several colleagues. And so I invited all of them to participate. Not all of them did for various reasons. And I totally understood that it was asking a lot for them to revisit this event. And doing the interviews was a difficult thing for all of us. But again, I think, again, with me being on the inside, I was able to elicit responses that I think others might not have gotten. So I'm happy to have been able to do that. Skipping on this, because I want to get to the data analysis. I've mentioned that, again, if you've done qualitative research, it's not easy, it's tedious. But when I got to the findings, what I wanted to do, instead of just having blocks of quotes from the interviews, which I do have some of that in my presentation, I wanted to be able to take the data, and Carolyn Mears had a child in the building during the Columbine shooting. And so for her dissertation, she wrote about the parents' perspective of that event. Her child was not injured, but her child obviously dealt with trauma and still does. And she wanted to focus on the impact of the parents. And so I used hers as a model, and she created this gateway method, which was a way to synthesize a lot of data, because with interviews, that's a lot of data. And she wanted to be able to represent it in a way that their words were still being heard. And so she broke their interviews down into these poetic representations. And so you're getting the story, but it's not just a block of a quote. So I definitely leaned on her. I was in contact with her and able to pick her brain about things, which is so fascinating about the research community, and another reason I'm so excited about this whole conference. But she focuses on telling the story instead of telling about the story, and that's what the gateway method allowed for me to do. So then I've got these great, here are your research findings and the nice little typical kind of charts. But what I wanted to do again is find a way for people to really hear the voice of those interviews. So I took the 15 interviews, 15 voices, and I unified them into one. And I'm going to share that with you now. It does take several minutes for me to read. I want to invite you to close your eyes. You do not have to. But I am going to be creating a narrative of that day for us. And so everything that I'm going to read comes straight from the interviews. So the sentences, this sentence may be from one person and another one and another one. So they're not blocks of quotes from one person. They are 15 voices that now are unified into one. And just for a little more perspective, I did include, these are the 8 students that we lost on that day. I did teach 4 of them. And this is something I know we all have in our lives, a before and after. And for Enterprise, Alabama, our lives are before the tornado and after the tornado. So these faces are some that we don't ever want to forget. In the moment, I remember trying not to appear too anxious in front of my students. I remember when they brought the bus drivers in. I remember thinking I might not see my family again. I remember they were holding each other. I remember him going to the gym to remove those kids and get them where it was safer. I remember how odd the sky looked, the separation. They had us where they thought the safest place to be was. We got the message that there was a tornado at the airport. It was coming in our direction. Get down, it's coming. Get your heads down, cover your heads. This is not a drill, this is real. I knew something was happening. The temperature just went down. The lights started flickering. The lights went out. It went completely dark. It was pitch black dark. He grabbed me and pulled me down. As soon as I hit the floor, that's when everything happened. Hearing the voices of all the kids around me and their terror. People were crying. Everybody was crying. She was screaming. She wanted her mama. I just wanted somebody to hold her. It was just a very loud noise. The noise was so loud and it kept getting louder and louder. Then all of a sudden it was quiet. The eye of the tornado was right over us. Then the noise started again. It sounded like a jet was landing on top of us. People talk about that it sounds like a freight train. It really does. I will never forget the roaring train sound when the storm hit. Literally an explosion. The building imploded, not exploded, imploded. The roof started coming off. The skylight was ripped out of its frame and the wall and the floor shook violently. Don't look up, don't look up, don't look up. Keep your heads down, keep your heads down, keep your heads down. The roof peeled back, but the walls caved in. The roof came down and came off, and the building fell around us. That wind was so strong. We heard the wind of the tornado. The wind was coming up the hallway. Doors began slamming shut. The wind blew open the 2 metal doors that led to the outside. I saw classroom doors go off the hinges. Windows and doors and everything was breaking loose. That drink machine got lifted up and moved over the top of 2 of my students. It sucked Dale up into a skylight, and then it let him go and dropped him back down. Huge concrete spans were lifted up by the tornado, but were so heavy they fell back down. My immediate natural response was to pray. I did a lot of praying. I told them to pray. I thought we were going to die. I prayed aloud. I knew something was happening. I moved forward. I put my arms around the 4 kids sitting across from me. I've got to protect them. The next thing I knew, the ceiling fell. In the moments after. I remember I couldn't get out. I remember the air just smelled of pine trees. I remember seeing all the power lines down. I remember the smell in that building. I remember when I walked down to school, I was in disbelief at the damage I saw. I remember I was standing there with my grade book. I remember thinking this was a dream. This is a nightmare. Oh my God, I've got to do something. I looked up and I could see the sky. There was no roof. Shards and pieces of the roof. And that gritty, dirty, dusty smell of the roofing and concrete. Fear, shock, and a sense of urgency to get out of the building. We had to move quick to get the kids out safe. Floor jack stands, anything we could think to use to help rescue kids from that rubble. The kids just started, kind of like birds hatching out of an egg. I saw a hand come out, he wiggled out a little bit, and then he stood up and left. Kids were coming out of the rubble like ants coming out of an anthill. We didn't know if the building was safe. Don't step on any wires. Someone said there could possibly be a gas leak. There was a gas leak in the science wing. I could smell gas. It was like you were in a cave. Trying to get the roads cleared where we could get rescue vehicles in there, impossible. That was a nightmare. It would have taken a crane to move that stuff. Do we need more medevac? I said, yes, we need all we can get. I looked down at her leg and it was like if you had just taken the skin and torn it from the ankle up to the knee and laid it aside. It was chaotic. It was a big empty space of silence. It seemed like hours. It was only a few seconds. I crawled through an opening where there was broken glass. I crawled through a window. I wanted to turn and run. I did not want to be there. People running. Kids got up and ran. They were going home. Doctors and nurses had run down the street from the hospital. Coaches ran to the field house to get a helmet for John. People standing. People in their front yards in disbelief. I just stood there in the space that was between all the classrooms. Just, I don't know, there. I just couldn't leave. I had no idea. The whole building was gone where I taught. What used to be the hallway for the science wing, there was nothing there. There were no walls. There was so much destruction. There was a lot of debris. There were cars everywhere and trash everywhere. There were no trees. It looked like bombs had gone off. It looked like a war zone. The buses looked like they were riddled with bullets. Breathe slowly. They're coming. Where the people were under the rubble. I knew that she was gone. They started putting bodies in the room. That's when it got real. Morgue, parents identifying them, cadaver dogs. Students are not supposed to get hurt and die in school. We're their safe place. You think we're in school, it's going to be fine, right? It wasn't fine that day. Those were our kids. Those were our kids who were pallbearers to other kids that they sat in the same classroom with. In the echo of the moment, I remember how close we all became going through it. I remember being on bus duty and it would be getting dark. I remember him telling us that he loved us after every meeting. I remember her knowing that her daughter was gone. I wanted to take care of them, but my heart was broken. I was in complete panic. I felt lost and overwhelmed. I felt more like a spectator than a participant, almost as if I was part of a movie, not moving in real life. I was crying and just feeling completely helpless. I couldn't offer comfort to anybody. I had no interest in Enterprise High School. I knew I belonged with my family. I wanted to know if my own children were okay. She was inconsolable. This doesn't happen, this doesn't happen, this can't be happening. That doesn't happen to a school. I never dreamed it would happen. I don't think it's going to happen to you, but it could happen. It can happen to my students and me. What could I have done? You're going to have to pray and prepare yourself. I hope I did say enough of the right things to make a difference. Those days are still very difficult for me to think about. There are probably some days I could talk about it and I'm okay, and there are other days that it just hits you. You just can't. Healing will never stop. So that is one of the ways that I wanted to share the findings, and that is definitely the way that I felt like my paper applied to this particular conference. I did include, there is a QR code at the end because I know I flew through all of this, so if you're interested at all in this study, especially if you are an administrator in a school and you haven't thought enough about your safety plan, you need to. And if you are a teacher in a teacher ed program, please spend more time focusing on preparing for what is going to happen, not if, but when. So if you would like to have this information, and I guess maybe there's going to be a source. I would love to be able to have everybody's contact information
Yes,
after,
yes,
so I'm hoping that will be something, but it also has a link to my dissertation. So thank you so much for your attention.